May I please invite Mark Goyder, Founder Director, Tomorrow's Company, for a keynote.
Well, good morning, everybody. When we talk about competitiveness, while we're just lining up the presentation, I wonder if there could be a special stream of work devoted to the architecture of our future conference centres in hotels. Have you ever noticed that actually the best conferences are those when we're all able to be as close as possible to each other, when we're as far as possible able to speak in the round with each other, as opposed to a design which makes it much more difficult for me to connect with you at the far end. So I do recommend to the Council on Competitiveness that there might be a stream of work there. While we're at it, do you think it's a good idea to have hotels where it's actually not possible to get to the ground floor by the stairs? I actually asked in the hotel yesterday, and I have to use the lift. Now, I say that as an aside, but it's part of what I want to talk about today, because the book I've been asked to talk about is subtitled Rediscovering the Human Purposes of Business. And I think there's a metaphor there. If we're so focused on the technical aspects of the organisation, are we actually forgetting the fundamental human aspects of the organisation? I was excited when I launched my book in India a year ago. It was the time that Mangalayam was just launched, and I'm even more excited to be back in India at a time when India has shown the Americans how to, forgive me, Deborah, how to do space exploration at, is it 1/40th of the cost? And I think that that's one wonderful reason for being in India this week. I think that a contrasting reason to be sober about being in India this week is perhaps everything that one reads about the Supreme Court judgment on the mines and what that says about a relationship between business and parts of government that is not wholly healthy, and I'm sure will be changed. The third thing that's in my mind, which I bring from London, is the news that many of you may be aware of about a great company called Tesco, which has had to announce a third profit warning in a year on the basis that it was counting revenue too soon and it was counting costs too late. Have we ever heard that before? And the serious concern that this was a company which was so much admired and thought to be getting things so right, which is something I want to come back to, because I believe, not only do I believe it's an illustration of, this is my executive summary of Michael Porter, by the way. Competitiveness, just when you think you're competitive, you are actually just about to become that feather duster. And to see it happen to a company like Tesco leaves one asking questions like, this is a listed company. Where is all the focus in the analysis of listed companies? We talk about shareholder value. We talk about earnings expectations for the next quarter. Where are the real fundamental drivers of what makes a successful company? And that's the theme which, by the time I have finished these remarks, I want to persuade you is linked with rediscovering the human purposes of business. Michael Porter, of course, famously said in that, I think it was the 1990 article of his, that it's only companies that can create sustainable competitive advantage. And he's right, but what is it in companies that creates sustainable competitive advantage? What is the essence? And what are the assumptions that we make about success? And do we actually, is there a gap between what we assume drives success and what actually drives success? And in the book, I ask these 5 questions. What do we think people are mainly motivated by money? Do we think they're only motivated by money? I mean, how many people think here think that people are motivated by money alone? Not many. Do we think that markets, including capital markets, should be the master and we really dance to their tune, and that share price is the thing that drives us? Or do we think that markets should be our servant? How many people think that markets should be the master? We have one. Brave man, we have one. Do we think that business is actually in a world of its own, or do we think that business is actually a servant of society? That it accepts the rules of society, that ultimately it is in some sense judged by the contribution it makes to society? How many people believe that business exists in a world of its own? Value. How do we think about value? We talk about shareholder value. Very often I hear people say, perhaps less so than when we founded 20 years ago, founded tomorrow's company, I hear people say, yeah, but you know, if you're going to give more to the stakeholders, you've got to give less to the shareholders. Well, do we believe that? I believe that with Michael Porter, that actually the concept of shareholder value being the outcome, the product that comes from the contribution to a business of all the relationships, customers, employees, society, as well as investors, suppliers. And final question, how do we think about people? Do we think about people as if they're shareholders? You've got to look after the shareholders, and if you forget the shareholders because you're worrying about the stakeholders, then you're neglecting a group of people you can't neglect. Well, hang on a minute. The shareholders. Everywhere you go in India, you look at the adverts for, I think on this one it's the sponsor ICICI Bank. By the way, I'm a customer of yours. And you see the adverts for retail savings. India is an economy with a huge savings capacity. Now, where are those savings going? Some of them are going into life insurance companies, which are going to be invested in companies. Some of them are going into pension products. Some of them are going, many of them are forming the huge blocks of wealth that are being invested in company. The stakeholders are the shareholders. There is no gap. Now, I had the privilege of talking about the book in November to a group of chief investment officers in Mumbai. And I did with them, only slightly more thoroughly, what I tried to do in this slightly unfriendly room. I asked them those questions. And they said, no, we think people aren't just motivated by money and so on. We think that markets should be servant, not master. And at the end I said to them, but do you think you operate in a system that observes those same views? And they said, no. No, they said, we operate in a system which tends to assume that people are only motivated by money. We tend to operate in a system which tends to assume that the market is the master, not the servant. So I said to them at the end, well, we've got a problem then, haven't we? And the chief investment officers that day said to me, yeah, we've got a problem. You know, we're operating in a system which actually is in denial of the fundamental things we believe drive successful companies. And this is the issue which I believe needs to be addressed. Let's just think, in case you think this is fluffy stuff, let's just think about some of the evidence, and I talk about it in the book. One of the most interesting examples of the evidence comes from Japan. And it was my friend in Tata who prompted me to write this book in an Indian context, who drew my attention to Professor Haruo Funabashi, who wrote about the 20,000 companies in Japan that have lived more than 100 years, the 600 companies in Japan that have endured more than 300 years, the 30 companies in Japan that have endured more than 500 years, and the 5 companies in Japan that have endured more than 1,000 years. And he looked at what they had in common. What did they have in common? They had leadership with clear purpose and values, which everybody in those organizations understood. They had a long-term viewpoint. They had an underlying respect for people. Many of you will remember from your business school days the work of two Stanford professors, Jim Collins and Jerry Porras, who did a study which tried to explain why a cluster of companies that they'd identified as most admired in the States outperformed the stock market average 15 times over 50 years. What did they have in common? A clear purpose and values, what they called a strong core ideology, the ability to hang on to the things that those companies really stood for, even while they might be changing markets, changing strategies, changing everything else. A belief in a purpose beyond shareholder value. Jim Stengel, who was marketing director of Procter & Gamble, has published quite recently a very interesting study in which he started by, he wanted to know which were the most successful brands and why, particularly looking at competitors of Procter & Gamble. And he didn't expect to find, he tells us, what he did find. Because, and I quote, what he did find was that companies which put the ideals of improving people's lives at the center of all they do outperform the market by a huge margin and frequently create both new businesses and entire new sectors. And he talks about these 5 key dimensions of improving people's lives. There isn't time to go into them now, but in that 10-year study, he says that investment in the companies which had those qualities would have outperformed the stock market 400%. And I could go on with other studies which are quoted in the book. What I'm saying to you is that rediscovering the human purpose of businesses is not a sideshow. It is at the heart of the competitiveness of our companies, which of course brings us to the question of how our companies are owned. And in the UK, over the last 5 years, since more now, since the crash, we in Tomorrow's Company, which is a business-led think tank, have been thinking very hard about what it means to be an owner, working with institutional investors, both in family businesses, both in the city, in listed companies, and in employee-owned businesses. And we've developed some principles of stewardship. And the idea of stewardship, we believe, is, we call it, it's something that is very close to the Gandhian idea of trusteeship. We call it the active and responsible management of entrusted resources, now and in the future, so as to hand them over in better condition. And at the moment, our capital markets are dominated by something nonsensical called agency theory. Agency theory, of course, works on the basis that people are only motivated by money. Agency theory gets you into the kind of earnings game that brought Enron to its knees and is now in danger of bringing Tesco to its knees. We don't need agency theory to grow the kind of companies that research tells us have the capability to last 50 or 100 years. What we need is stewardship theory. We need an acceptance of the idea that companies need owners who will nurture them, challenge them, and have a sense that there is a balance to be struck between today and tomorrow. Have a sense that they will only be long-term successful if they do connect with human need, that constantly challenge them about their current performance and their future capability, and that are very clear that they need to have a purpose beyond profit. Now, the question I want to leave with you is, are we satisfied, particularly in the listed sector and in the private equity sector, that we are getting from our ownership and our investment the kind of challenge and the kind of ownership that we need to grow the competitive companies of the future? Your Prime Minister made a great speech yesterday, and his theme of FDI means first develop India appealed to me. And I didn't have to change very much, incidentally, in the slide that I'd previously prepared here. He didn't talk about Sanskar. What I want to say about this is, and this is something I learned from my friend Anant Nadkarni in Tata, who inspired me to write the book. What is Sanskar? Sanskar, I understand, is a Hindu concept, which talks about a process which transforms a person into an ideal and outstanding personality by eradicating the negative mental tendencies existing within him and by inculcating human values and qualities which make him more dynamic, discreet, duty-conscious and responsible towards himself as well as family and society. Entrepreneurial India needs Sanskar. We are only going to get, in any society, the freedoms we need and the freedoms which the Prime Minister wants to deliver if in the culture of the country we build up that sense of individual responsibility. The two are absolutely intertwined. So the vision for any government in a country which wants to be competitive has to be that balance between freedom with responsibility, between a culture of self-discipline and entrepreneurialism. In the UK, very largely as a result of work we did with business leaders, the Companies Act was changed in 2006 to reflect what we would call an inclusive approach to success. The idea, instead of saying that, which incidentally company law in the UK, and I suspect India has never said, it's never said that companies are simply there to create value for shareholders. Company law has always been that the directors of a company owe their duty to the company as a going concern to promote that company for the future. They're accountable to shareholders in how they do that, but their duty is to the company. That's a vital distinction, and never more vital than when you get into the way in which you legislate for mergers and acquisitions. Because the danger, if you don't legislate carefully, is that all the good things that you create in terms of a company which is focused on long-term performance and stewardship can be put at risk by a marketplace which seeks to put a present value which is unable to put a future value on those qualities. And we've had that argument in the UK with the recent AstraZeneca-Pfizer proposed takeover. And I have argued to company chairmen in the UK, under UK law, it is not necessarily the case that in a takeover situation, you simply accept the highest offer. Your duty is to decide whether the company is best served by this owner or that owner. And that is the stewardship responsibility. So company law, mergers and acquisitions, the encouragement of entrepreneurialism, and long-term stewardship. The vision for the future for me would be that long-term, that saver who's putting those funds into their life insurance policy or their pension policy could actually feel connected with the kind of great Indian companies that are being built. How do we create a capital market which does that? So I leave with you the challenge that alongside economic geography, alongside the physical infrastructure, there is a cultural, there is an emotional, there is a human, there's even a spiritual infrastructure that underlies competitiveness. And all the history tells us that we neglect that at our peril. Thank you very much.
If anybody has a question from Mark here, we can have about a minute or two with him for questions. Yes. Yes, sir.
Well, I think I must first congratulate you for a brilliant piece of this thing. All that one is saying is, are we then measuring wrong things when we look at corporates, when we look at the society? Are we measuring wrong things and taking them to a different direction?
Yes, we're measuring the wrong things, or at least we're measuring things in an unbalanced way. I have a friend who spent his life in HR. He's got a wonderful list he's given me called 20 HR questions every investor should be asking. And actually, you know, when we look at the most corporate disasters, afterwards, the horrible thing is, people come out of the woodwork and say, I could have told you there was something wrong. He was a bully. I didn't dare say I didn't dare say what was going on. I didn't dare say the accountants, that there were two sets of accounts. We know these things inside organisations. Why, with all the sophistication of analysts in the City of London, are we incapable of detecting them from further out?
Awesome. Any other question from Mark, please? Like, we have time for one question. So we'll take the person from the back. Yes. We have to be inclusive, right, Sunan? So we have Sadarji at the back. Can we have a question from him? Yeah, we'll do that.
About sustainable value. In very recent times, the Companies Act 2013 has mandated compulsory corporate social responsibility spending for large organizations, which is actually a first in the world. Do you think that for a country like India, business responsibility would also have to be compulsorily mandated, and how is it actually taken on and taken off in other parts of the world? Because clearly Indian companies are forgetting their sustainable responsibility to the ecosystem at large. So we needed regulation to get social responsibility mandated. Will we also need regulation to enforce sustainable business operations?
It's a complicated question. My best answer to it is to say, my first job in industry, more years ago than I care to remember, I was, after a year out of university, I was made health and safety officer in an engineering company. I was at the time asked to implement for that company the effect of a new Health and Safety at Work Act. That act in the UK in 1974 did something very clever. On the one hand, it built on all the prescriptive regulation, which you have to have about fire, about grinding machines and all of that. But what it did, it then said to companies, you state in your own words your health and safety policies. It didn't tell them how to say it. It said you state your policy. And then it said, and state the mechanisms by which you will then implement that policy and how you will be held accountable. Now what I like about that, that's the kind of regulation I call indicative regulation. It doesn't tell you down to the last iota what you do. It forces you to think what you do. It forces you to declare how you will do it. And it leaves a process of transparency to determine in that institution and outside it the progress you're making. Now, if we're talking about that kind of regulation, then yes. But it's got to be done in that spirit of Sanskar, that spirit that we are trying to promote the self-responsibility of individuals and institutions, and not in a spirit of imposition. And it's got to have values at the heart of it. Companies being challenged. I'm not interested in corporate social responsibility reports anymore. They're too predictable. I would be much more interested in companies in their integrated annual reports saying on page 1 from the chairman onwards, we want you to judge us by these values. And these values you will see them expressed in all the pages of this report. They include what we have done, very importantly, in the areas of our societal impact, but they are integrated in everything we do.
And not for action, for actually doing it.
Thank you, Mark. This was absolutely a stunning talk. Thanks a lot for being here with us today. Mark, thanks.